And it looks like we're live. So, welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Today is Sunday, so we're going to do the Sunday stream. And today is sort of well, the lighting's not as bad as usual. How odd. Anyway, today's sort of a sequel to yesterday's episode, just because I think there was some unfinished business. So, I'll try to summarize what we talked about here yesterday. So yesterday, it was all about how the rise and fall of rock and roll's popularity paralleled but wasn't directly related to the rise and fall of the North American suburb. And when you think about it, what two things, broken chair, what two things developed after the Second World War at close to the same time? Well, the suburbs really began in the late 40s, but really became a prominent living space and sort of sociological phenomenon in the 50s. And it was also by the sort of early to mid 50s, 1954, 1955, where people that were inspired by, or in some cases previously performing R&B music, came to develop a style of music known as rock and roll. People like Bill Haley and the Comets with Rock Around the Clock, people like Little Richard, people like Chuck Berry, then people like Elvis Presley, and then later people like the Big Bopper, um, Peggy Sue, I'm having that brain moment. But the day the music, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and so that was sort of the first generation of rock and roll. And in its various guises and subgenres, rock came to be the dominant music that informed what pop was by the late 60s. So by the time you get to the late 60s and the 70s, all forms of pop music were being influenced by the sound, the arrangement, the rhythmic tendencies of rock and roll. And it was also in the 70s when the genre kind of, sort of, it ceased being threatening. It was no longer purely rebellious music that your parents hated. It was the kind of music that was becoming more sophisticated in terms of production, in composition, in arrangement, in sort of progressive musical ideas. And it also became really big money in terms of record sales, in terms of concert tickets, and in terms of being the dominant music of FM radio. And all of this paralleled the suburbs becoming the de facto location for the mildly prosperous to incredibly prosperous white middle class family. And it was in these households that the people who were young and male gravitated towards rock and roll more than any other genre. And in many ways, the suburbs were tailor made for rock. The two-car garages that were attached to most suburban homes were the perfect place to start a rock band. Frank Zappa talks about it in Joe's Garage. It was the perfect place to listen to it because, unlike in previous generations or in countries that were less prosperous than the United States and similar places, most young kids, even at a relatively young age, had their own bedroom where they could have their own stereo system and they could rock out. And they certainly did. And I mentioned that, yeah, there were differences between the sexes. If a 17-year-old male in 1977 would be listening to your Journeys and your Bostons and your Foreigners and your Eagles and your Doobie Brothers, and a bit of Yes, maybe for the more progressive side, and a bit of Black Sabbath for the more hard side, and everyone listened to Led Zeppelin. The female in the family might be more into danceable music and disco music by the late 70s, but among the young males of the great American suburb, rock and roll was the de facto music. They had it playing in their cars, playing it in their rooms, and many even tried to create it in their garages next to, over by the Dodgers, as Frank Zappa said. And many great bands began that way. Now, rock and roll began to decline in the 90s, even though a lot of people didn't notice it at the time. That's where our story left off yesterday, and that's kind of where I want to pick it up today. And so let's just recap which genres began to encroach on the real estate on both the radio dial and the record shelf of young people in the 90s. Well, first of all, there was hip hop, which began in the 70s, but really, even in the early 80s, it was something that for white audiences was a matter of curiosity. It didn't have the deeper meaning and the communal and conscious aspects that it did for black audiences, because hip hop grew out of black neighborhoods, where it was a form, like all forms of poetry, of communication, communication of the news, communications of opinions, communications of activism, which is just, a very, charged form of opinion. But for white audiences in the age of the Sugar Hill Gang and Run DMC, it remained more of a curiosity than anything else. Rock was the dominant form. By the late 80s, not only were people like Ice-T and NWA taking the West Coast and then all of Black America by storm, but they eventually took all of America by storm. But it was in the 90s, as the production became ever more sophisticated and the lyrics became ever more lyrical, that white audiences began to find not only very interesting music to listen to in albums like Dr. Dre's The Chronic, Snoop Doggy Dogg as he was in those days, Doggy Style, also a Dr. Dre album, but that West Coast lyricism combined with the West Coast production style and the elevation of reality rap, as it was originally called, into what the industry repackaged as gangster rap, it started to get a lot of white audiences, particularly and especially young ones, to turn their heads, because it fulfilled a lot of the same things that rock had fulfilled in previous generations. When the suburbs were calm places, of when they were family oriented, when they were safe places, the rock and roll served as a kind of musical escapism. You would escape from the quiet streets into the big arena where you could pump your fist and go like this with your head. The lyrics, some of them were fantastical, some of them were about women, some of them were about all these sorts of things that a young adolescent white male would have thought, this is cool. Now, rock music in the 90s became less about fantasy than about subjects that were a bit less inspired and a bit more depressing. I'm talking about grunge. Grunge was not about fantasy the way that a lot of it wasn't about romance or fantasy the way that AOR rock, hard rock, heavy metal, and prog rock were. The various genres of mainstream rock and their subgenres that were dominant in the 70s and 80s. And here comes hip hop, which was both reflective of a lot of the dangers of urban inner city America, but it was also very aspirational, the way that rock had once been. It was about, getting things done, doing it. It was about being big and being the best. And a lot of people were starting to get turned on by that. There was the saying that not Dr. Dre, that Ice-T talked about how young white kids were starting to listen to him and not the white bands, and how that was scaring a lot of boomer parents, in the same way that greatest generation parents were scared when the boomer kids were listening to Elvis and Chuck Berry. Ice Cube talked about how the Bon Jovi and Journey posters were coming down, and the NWA posters were coming up. And so, while there was still a lot of rock in the 90s, and you could still argue that it was the mainstream pop music du jour, hip hop and R&B were definitely influencing pop production styles. Think of Boys to Men, think of the Fugees, that were huge pop sellers, as big as anything, bigger than many, if not most, rock bands. It was a harbinger of things to come. But there was also something very interesting happening in a genre of music that, at least in terms of how it used to be marketed, was very different. If rap represented the honest poetry of black artists talking about their experiences, country and western music had been the opposite. Extremely white people talking about their experiences. And early country and western music was very much about realism. Frank Zappa again made the argument that while the wives of senators in the 80s wanted to censor rock and R&B, they didn't touch country music because of various donors, maybe. But when you look at it, people like Hank Williams, people like Johnny Cash, people like Waylon Jennings, their music was all about realism. Kenny Rogers, while he began in the rock world, he achieved success in the country world. I mean, his music is filled with realism. I mean, Coward of the County, come on. It's as real and as raw as anything that NWA or Schoolie D or Ice-T talked about. And then you have people like Chris Christopherson, again, talking about real experiences in his songwriting. You've got Willie Nelson. So country had always been less about fantasy per se than about realism. And it was always a genre that was influential to others, although it always, with a few exceptions of your superstars, like early crossover superstars, your Glenn Campbell's, who was a session musician also, your Kenny Rogers, later on your Dolly Partons. It always kept arm's length in terms of how it was marketed from both rock and soul and R&B. And a lot of that is because while rock, soul, and R&B by the 70s were all coming out of record labels based in LA. Even Motown had by then moved from Detroit to LA in terms of their main operations. Country always had their operations in Nashville. So RCA and Columbia and all the big labels, they had their LA operations, their New York operations. And as LA got bigger, it sort of overtook New York. Nashville was always kind of clustered. And so the record labels were producing and marketing the music without necessarily daily communication with the boys in LA or New York. Now, in the 90s, that began to change as you began to see country artists that were making music that was being marketed to mainstream pop audiences. You had people like Garth Brooks, who was probably the king of this 90s era crossover, Alan Jackson, Brooks and Dunn. Later on, you had Shania Twain. And later after that, you had Toby Keith and Tim McGraw, and even, surprise of all surprises, Taylor Swift. We'll get to that in a minute. And so in the 90s, you had this weird era where the pop charts could at one minute be dominated by Garth Brooks, the next minute dominated by Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Tupac, and the next minute dominated by Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Nirvana. Something had to give. And what eventually gave out was the music industry itself, because Napster comes along in the late 90s and destroys the music industry. That wasn't the intent of Napster, but the music industry was dumb all over, a little ugly on the side. And what they did is they sued Napster out of existence instead of doing what they should have done, which is to work out some sort of deal. The art of the deal, people. They should have either acquired Napster, worked on some sort of licensing agreement to make Napster legal, either with ads or with a freemium model or both, because eventually the tech industry ended up doing that anyway. But by the time that they did, the music industry was on its back, because even though they successfully sued Napster out of existence, it was the music industry that never recovered. The tech industry most certainly did. And as the music industry continued to die a death in the early 2000s under the weight of Napster clones like Kazaa and LimeWire and others, Steve Jobs went up to the music industry and he said, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. I'm going to develop a way for people to listen to music on their devices, on their PCs, that is even more convenient than the Napster clones. And yes, they'll pay for it, but it will be so reasonable. It will be so much bang for the buck. People will be willing to pay for it. Because this was an era, too, when a lot of viruses were being transmitted on the Napster clones. And so people would have been responsive to that. And they were. Steve Jobs, as he was right about many things, was definitely right about this. And he said, so here's the deal. We're going to sell each song on each album for $1. And the music industry goes, and he said, okay, or you can just completely evaporate. And so he grabbed them, by the what, and made them an offer they couldn't refuse, and they took it. And from then on, the music industry was reduced gradually to more of a PR agency, a marketing agency, because technology also allowed people to increasingly record and distribute their music. The two things that record labels were needed for, financing the recording and distribution, they weren't needed for anymore. And so we see a lot of consolidation of musical forms. Now, rock and roll never really recovered. And a lot of that is due to the sociological changes. Those suburban households that sort of bred rock consumers and rock performers started to change. A lot of the sort of precipice of that was the Great Recession. It meant that a lot of these homes were foreclosed on. People started having having smaller families, particularly white Americans and black Americans. But with the suburbs, it obviously is a more of a white issue in the context. Some people started to have no children at all. And so this idea of, Billy and Bobby, sharing albums. So check out the new release from the Doobie Brothers. Oh, cool, but I like the harder stuff. Check this Uriah Heep out. That culture was ending. And the young people that were there were being influenced by hip hop. And because of that, the major pop idiom of the last 20 years of the 21st century so far has been hip hop. Look at Taylor Swift. She started out as a country singer, but now her production style is sort of danceable music that all derives from a watered down version of hip hop, in the same way that a lot of the singer songwriter pop music of the 70s was effectively a watered down version of rock and roll. Now, country, though, tended to survive. And again, and not only survive, but absolutely thrive. The big country artists that made it big in the 90s continue to sell big into the 2000s, and even more country artists came along. And then something else rather interesting happened. As rock and roll slipped back and back from the sort of epicenter of the pop music world, country and hip hop R&B, contemporary R&B that is, they started to shake hands, and there started to be a lot of crossover in the same way that in the 70s there was a lot of fusion and crossover between sort of contemporary rock on the one hand and other forms of art that were generally created by black artists like R&B, funk, soul, and even jazz fusion. And now that trend, as we go into 2025, halfway through the 2020s, that trend of combining country, pardon me, and R&B, hip hop derived music is even more intertwined. You have people like Bruno Mars doing a bit of both. You have people like Jelly Roll doing a bit of both. You have Lil Nas X doing a bit of both. And most prominently, you have Beyonce releasing her first country album. There are cowboy hats, there are horses. It is unambiguously country from someone whose entire career, pretty much up to this point, was in hip hop derived R&B. And so why did this happen? Well, as the suburbs and the rock and roll that sustained them have retreated more and more, we're seeing the other two parts of the American landscape become more prominent, the urban and the rural or rural adjacent. And so, because of that, these trends in demography and sociology are affecting the pop charts. Now, as I said, the suburbs are still there physically, at least most of them, but their purpose, their economic affordability levels, their demography is very different than it was between the 60s, between the 50s and the 90s. That classic archetypal suburb that began in the Leave It to Beaver era and with surprisingly few cosmetic changes remained the same into the Bill and Ted era and the Fast Times at Richmond High era and the Ferris Bueller era. That is less and less recognizable in the suburbs of today. Neil Peart of Rush, be careful of what you wish for, because your fans who listen to your song criticizing suburbs, they kind of took it to heart. Everything now is either very urban, very rural, or a fusion of both, which is why you see R&B and hip hop artists wearing cowboy hats and singing modern style country music. It's why you see people from the country world, having 808 beats behind them like a hip hop artist would. And because music, especially when you don't have a strong music industry, in the 70s it was financially strong, but it wasn't strong in terms of intervening overly hands on in the creation of music. And now that the music industry itself is just a glorified PR agency, you're having people discovering new music on TikTok and elsewhere before they censor that too. That's okay, we're going to get it save. Am I allowed to say that on YouTube? Oh, God bless Alphabet. Don't censor me. Um, anyway, you're seeing people now exposed on the internet to both. And again, the idea of fusion in the modern sense, meaning the 21st century sense, does owe a lot to the internet because, on the one hand, the algorithms of the internet try to segregate us a lot. But all it takes is a little bit of effort and interaction to break down the algorithmic segregation. And for someone who likes, one comedian to discover another comedian, someone who likes one kind of music to discover an influencer they respect or are entertained by promoting a different kind of music. And voila, in the same way that we're seeing less and less of the traditional suburban lifestyle, but more of a confluence of both urban and rural. The 64 Impala on the one hand and the F-150 on the other. We're seeing these trends combine on the music charts, and there is no sign of it stopping. I mean, Taylor Swift herself is the most successful person ever to begin squarely in the world of Nashville and end up in the worlds of sort of LA and New York, combining the sort of country and white sensibility with music whose production style is very sort of watered down hip hop, very danceable, and with crossover appeal to various audiences. Now, yes, her audience is still mostly young, female, and white, but there are influences in the music that have definitely trickled down so that you get people, again, like Jelly Roll, who's got elements of hip hop, elements of country and western. In terms of both the music and the image, you've got Beyonce crossing over. You've got Darius Rutger talking about being one of the, not the first, certainly not the first, but a major Black artist from a different era who is now fully immersed in the world of Nashville country. And so, as rock and roll died, in terms of being a mainstream format, you have other genres that are sort of taking its place, even though just a few decades ago, there were very few points of direct connectivity between country and hip hop R&B on the other hand. But that's only half the story, because there have always been origins of these genres of R&B on the one hand and country and western on the other that have a point of commonality. Both were very much influenced by European folk music, by African American blues music, and by sort of American neoclassical music, if you want to call it that, ragtime, and other forms of piano driven composition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, one of my favorite artists of all time, who's generally considered a soul R&B artist, Swamp Dogg, he said it best. When he was talking about his origin, said that he never really saw a difference between soul music and R&B music. He said that when he was growing up in rural Virginia, I believe it was, he didn't have access to a lot of black music stations, so he'd be listening to the country and western stations, and those were his biggest influences. And as he got older and had more access to the R&B and soul music, he said that there isn't that much of a difference. It's really a matter of the intonation. One is more of a drawl and laid back, one is a bit more forward and syncopated, but at the end of the day, he noticed, just through being a very perceptive and talented artist, what a lot of musicologists have found out, that the origins of what we consider mid-century country and mid-century R&B aren't all that different, which just goes to show you that the more things change, the more they stay the same. As always, like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.